and we're going to start our next session. This session is brought to you by and sponsored by the Dallas Impact Investing Network. We actually have a couple members on this prestigious panel that I feel so honored to be able to moderate today, that are members of the Dallas Impact Investing Network, that are truly really pushing forward the thought leadership, and not just the thought leadership, but the actual action behind impact investing here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so if you haven't connected with them or want to learn more about the organization, you can go to their website. I think it's DallasImpactInvestingNetwork.org. Don't quote me, it might be .com. But visit there and you can sign up on the newsletter to learn more about what they're doing in the Dallas ecosystem. And so I am honored again to be joined by this group of powerhouse ladies. It was actually not by intention that all of our panelists that were chosen to speak on all three panels were all women. And then we got Eric added last minute. But literally I was searching for experts, and it just so happened to be that you all were women. And I think that's pretty cool and exciting to see so many women really breaking down barriers and leading in these spaces. And so I'm honored to be in you guys' presence and hope this to be a fruitful, insightful conversation. I know it will, given all you guys' background and the work you guys are doing. So to set up our conversation, integrated capital, financing for a new majority, I'll just start with a brief overview and introduce our panelists, or actually have you guys introduce yourselves in a little bit, maybe teeny bit about your work. Don't get too deep because I'm going to ask you questions around your work. Just to get into our discussion for today, some of the stats around our current state of our economy is just less than 2% of venture capital has landed in the hands of women and minorities. Minorities are also 3 times likely to be denied small business loans than their white counterparts. While the browning of our population in our country steadily increases, the wealth gap in this country has not been reflective as such. And so the question that we're going to pose really around this conversation is, how do the systems and institutions play a role in creating greater access and unlocking risk capital for this new majority? And what are the alternative financing strategies and sources of capital underutilized that are more friendly to underestimated entrepreneurs to help grow business ownership and to address our wealth gap? So I'm joined by both local and national, I want to say that, thought leaders, impact investors, and practitioners in the space to discuss how we can reimagine our systems and our strategies to help create a more equitable and inclusive economy. And those are a lot of buzzwords. So I want to preface that by saying, if you're on this call and you hear a lot of buzzwords, throw it in the chat. We'll throw some definitions out for you all. But I want to make sure we're all using the same language and growing together as we kind of move forward on this conversation. And so I want to introduce by name first, and then let them explain a little bit more about their background and what they do. Each one of our panelists. I want to start with Tynesia Boyea-Robinson, who is the president and CEO of CapEQ. Thank you for joining us. And also want to introduce Deb Nelson, who is the vice president of community engagement for RSF Social Finance, client and community engagement for RSF Social Finance. I want to introduce Deborah Frieze, who is the president and CEO of the Boston Impact Initiative. And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce Burnett, who is the Chief Impact Officer of Phillips Foundation. So some of our objectives for this conversation are really around how do we gain insights from our community, what strategies and models are working in other ecosystems, and how can we replicate and build upon those strategies? How can you all play a role in the ecosystem to help enable some of this great work that's happening? And understanding the importance of why this is so urgent now. Like, why is this important now to our community, given our current political climate, as well as our social climate? Why is this important to us now? So I named off a little bit, a few of the stats, but one I wanted to also kind of note and bring to light is A recent study showed that by 2053, the median household wealth for Black and Latinx families will reach zero. And so that is a huge inequity that has a multitude of drivers. You could talk about home ownership. We could talk about access to capital and building wealth through entrepreneurship. But those are typically the two vehicles that are most viable for individuals to build wealth: small business ownership and foundational ways to start building wealth. But we know that the gaps necessary on each side of equity are not prevalent. So let's start on the ground floor. We'll start with you, Ty. As president and CEO of CapEQ, you help institutions and impact investors align resources, capital, and people and ideas to create collective impact. You've recently been working with institutions like the Brookings Institute and Certain Foundation to uncover some of the truths behind what's actually going on with minority businesses. Can you tell us a bit about that work in particular and how those opportunities can translate to meaningful impact?
Absolutely. Happy to be here, Ben. And here in the green room, but everyone was just loving on Ben and saying how awesome it is to see how far this has come. So happy to be here and excited for what I'm seeing. Ben mentioned that I've been working on a national effort actually for the past 3 years called Path to 1555. 1555 is from a stunning stat from a report called the Tapestry Report, that if 15% of Black businesses could hire at least one employee, it would result to $55 billion to the economy. So if you want to talk about impact, investing in Black businesses is one of the many ways, but one of the underrepresented and underinvested ways to actually fuel and grow our economy. Brookings Institution is one of our partners, and we actually commissioned an additional study to really go into dream space. What would it look like if Black businesses achieved parity? And we've seen everything from that report to 1.6 million jobs would be created. We talked about the trillions of dollars in revenue that could be generated from those businesses if they were represented. So this is not just a social imperative, it's an economic imperative. And I think when you kind of peel back the layers, we talked about closing racial wealth gaps. For a long time, business ownership was actually underinvested in, particularly in the philanthropic space. When you think about closing racial wealth gaps as a social issue. And then on top of that, it was exacerbated. The reason why we don't have parity amongst businesses is the research has shown, both in the Tapestry Report, a report by McKinsey, and also Brookings, that Black businesses are continually denied access to capital across all of its forms. Less than 1% of Black business owners actually get venture capital. Black business owners are 3 times likely to get loans than other institutions, even if they have very similar backgrounds. And even when they do get loans, they actually have paying higher interest. So we are suppressing and oppressing the ingenuity and wealth opportunity for Black businesses across our country. And then I'd say the other opportunity, if you really think about what Black businesses do for Black people, 1 in 5 Black people are actually hired by Black across the country. And then Black businesses owners are 12 times wealthier than their Black business non-owner peers. So if you care about closing the racial wealth gap, if you are enlightened now post George Floyd, or if you've been in that fight for a while, you really can't get to this other side of what justice looks like without a true investment and support of not just the Black business owners themselves, but the ecosystems that allow them to thrive.
A lot there, but I think what we're looking at and what I take from that is the structural barriers, right, that exist that are sometimes unseen. I think sometimes people can't wrap their head around some of the stats and some of the things that you mentioned that they've never had to consider or never faced, right? And so we're going to come back to that ecosystem conversation because I know that's your thing. But I want to move over to Deb with RSF Social Finance. You guys have been a national and global player in the social finance space since 1984. How has the evolution of traditional markets caused you all to think differently around how capital flows through our economic system?
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm just a huge fan of the work that you all are doing. And as far as RSF, we've known, like most of you, we've known that traditional financial systems have not been working for most people and for the planet for a long, long time. Much of that is actually by design. to keep power very concentrated in a very small number of people. And what I've learned after working for over 20 years in this space, both with impact investors and with social entrepreneurs, is that the problem is not that the solutions don't exist. There are plenty of solutions, there's plenty of money. The problem is that so often the best solutions don't get recognized or supported or funded, especially if the people who are identifying those solutions are women or people of color, and that's got to change. It's time. A lot of people are ready for change, and we can all be a part of that. So at RSF, we decided to use an integrated approach. So we know that social entrepreneurs need different forms of capital at different periods of time. And so we started with a social investment fund that's like an impact CD. It's a 90-day note. Minimum investment is $1,000. And we've been supporting great social enterprises for 36 years. We realized that's not enough. We need to also provide, in addition to providing loans, loan guarantees, technical assistance grants, mission-related investing, flow funding, shared gifting circles, a lot of different forms of social capital. So we created collaboratives, and those are philanthropic initiatives that enable us to provide more flexible capital. So again, those other forms of funding in addition to social capital. And so we created a capital collaborative. We have other collaboratives that are focused on food and ag and racial justice, biodynamics, Waldorf education. We know we're a small shop. We're a little over 200 million in assets under management. So we have a lot of partners and allies, and we work as a collaborative or a collective. We work with many of you on this panel because we're trying to flow as much financial capital as we can where it's needed most and not to the usual suspects.
You guys are doing, Deb, and such a rich history in being pioneers in the space. And so you mentioned, you took an integrated capital approach. And so as we dive more into this conversation, we're going to go all the way from the systems level down to like what this actually looks like on the ground with people like myself and Deborah Frieze and how this is actually working in communities. But you also started in 2017, the Integrated Capital Institute. So talk a little bit about the Institute and some of the successes you might be seeing through that from your approach.
Happy to. And Deborah Frieze is an advisor and a presenter and has been part of our Integrated Capital Institute from the very beginning. So thank you, Deborah. So part of our work is myth busting. So most of us have been taught, don't talk about money. When it comes to finances, leave it to the experts, and money will keep you safe and make you happy. So part of the work that we're doing is busting those myths. And another part of the work that we're doing is sharing what we've learned about the power of capital. Most people are not using the power of their money. It's an incredible tool that actually can be leveraged for positive systemic change. And so we've been working over the past 4 years, we've been training incredible financial activists on how do you leverage both financial capital, different forms of capital, and social capital, and use the power of networks to solve complex social and environmental problems. And we have just been blown away by the fellows that have come through this program. Our alumni are doing things like activating tens of millions of dollars using a racial justice lens. They are supporting local living economies in different local regions, such as Appalachia. They're working with wealth holders to use a whole portfolio approach to solve a specific social, economic, or environmental problem. And we're about to launch the Just Economy Institute in a couple of months, so stay tuned for more news soon.
I'll definitely be in the know of that and awesome work you guys are doing, and showing how it's inspired so many others to kind of take that mantle and continue to run. So you guys are a torchlighter per se in the community, and so kudos to you guys for being that spark. So I'm going to go over to our other Deborah Frieze, over there in Boston, Beantown there. So I know that I'm inspired by what you are doing, and we'll talk more about, you know, how we're involved in what your work that you're doing. But very uniquely, your fund, in the mission of your fund, you state that it's focused on economic justice. So tell us what economic justice means to you and how that shows up in the work that you guys do in communities.
Awesome. I just want to start by saying I wish I were with you all in Dallas. It's 9 degrees here. So if this were not virtual, you would have saved me from what's going on up here in Boston. And delighted to be with you all. There's a lot of collaboration among us, we panelists here, so you'll hear more about that. So starting with, you know, Tynesia gave the frame of what's needed, and Deb talked about integrated capital. So we are applying that. So what Boston Impact Initiative is now Deb said small fund, 200 million. Yes, we're teeny, little $7 million charitable loan fund that is working to close the racial wealth divide in Eastern Massachusetts. And to do that requires rethinking sort of like 3 core questions: who gets funded, how do they get funded, and who decides? Right. So we got to start out with the fact, and you already laid out the data about entrepreneurs of color not getting the capital that they need. So the first piece of justice is we are investing in entrepreneurs of color and enterprises that support working class communities of color. Right. That's who we're invested in. How they get funded is where you start to see structural change. So part of the systemic and structural reasons that entrepreneurs of color don't get capital is things like credit scores, personal guarantees, all kinds of regulatory practices or things that are labeled as regulatory practices that are by design racially structured to inhibit the flow of capital to entrepreneurs of color. So we've gotten rid of all of that, right? So we never check a credit score. We never take a personal guarantee. And part of what we're trying to do is say, so some people call it character-based lending. We do lending, we do equity, we do non-traditional forms of capital. And that's the other piece of it. So right now, when you look at a moment like COVID, and I go to all my fellow lenders, whether they're the banks or the community development financial institutions, and they're saying nobody wants any loans. We're like, yeah, they don't want what you're offering, 5 to 7 year term loans with a fixed interest rate. Nobody wants that. We've been able to move money at the same rate through COVID as we have in any other year, because there's ways of structuring capital that fit early stage entrepreneurs, that fit underrepresented entrepreneurs. These are things like using royalty finance, receivable financing, getting that friends and family equity into the system that's missing for entrepreneurs of color. And the other piece about funding for justice is not trying to maximize your return to make as much money as you can on BIPOC entrepreneurs, or to minimize your risk in the same way conventional institutions do that. So what we look at, we never lend at higher than 7%. We generally lend at 5 to 7%, and we lend right now at 4%, whereas the folks that we're lending to often are given 9 to 15% through legitimate institutions, and way more than that through online lending, right? And when we take equity positions, what we do is we cap our exit. So for those of you who are less financial, we'll say there's a ceiling on how much money we want to make on you. What we want to do is have the surplus accrue to the owners and the workers. How do we get the control of wealth back into the hands of owners and workers that are in diverse companies? So there's a lot more to say about structuring capital for justice, but the third piece is who decides, which is you cannot have Black and brown entrepreneurs walk into a room that is an investment committee of white male finance folks. It just doesn't work. And so who decides for us lives at a number of levels. First of all, I'm the only white person on our team. The staff is in relationship and comes from the communities that we're investing in. Our investment committee is representational, as well as is our board. And more importantly, our board is community-based organizations. They are the majority control of our board. They appoint the investment committee. So how do we start putting community voice into the allocation of capital and disaggregate the capital where it's accumulated from the decision-making, the power about how it flows? So that's part of how to weave justice all the way through.
So I'm over here like, yes, like I want to like go deep into that with you. I know this isn't the setting for that, but I hope everyone got a chance to digest how equity shows up and the model that they're doing, so much that you've seen some 6 or 7 years doing invest. You guys kind of just started, getting money out the door, right? People always ask, well, how do you start? Writing a check and seeing what happens and testing it out, right? And learning and building on that. So talk a little bit about how the successes of the recent years and you guys actually deploying integrated capital to then expanding and taking this model to say, okay, we want to bring 26 other leaders from different cities together to also learn in community and continue to deploy these strategies that really, really bake equity throughout the whole system and the whole strategy.
Absolutely. And I'd say that, for me, some of this started really with what Deb was doing at RSF with the Integrated Capital Fellowship, which, as she mentioned, I'm a part of. And these are sort of two puzzle pieces that go together. You've got to make the case for doing the work. And then you got to get also, for those who want to build funds, how do you do fund design? And what happened to us, we had a pilot fund from 2013 to 2017 that was $3 million. We're now in our $7 million fund. We started getting calls from all over the country saying, prior to last year, right before the George Floyd moment, it was like, how do you invest with a racial justice lens at the center of an investing strategy, which we've been doing since 2013? And we are not alone in that. But it's not coming from the financial institutions. It's from folks on the ground like you, Benjamin, right? So it's like Dallas is part of that, and Catherine and Benjamin together have been engaged in this cohort as a supporter and as a participant. And in these other communities where we were saying, who out there says it's time to create a place-based solution? It's about our local community. And those of us in Boston have no idea what Dallas needs or what Chattanooga needs or what Seattle needs. It's not for us to replicate our model and control our model and scale it up that way. It's to share what we know, like Deb is doing with her fellowship. So who has a place that they want to solve for, who wants to use integrated capital, that's core for the reasons Deb laid out, and then to close the racial wealth divide. And so many folks stepped forward and said, this is what we need to do in our community. And we need, again, folks of color designing and launching and controlling the allocation of capital in their own community. And so just as some highlights, I know you guys are going gangbusters and I'll let you tell that story. But one of the people in the cohort is Marcus Owens from the African American Leadership Forum in Minneapolis. And what's happened in his journey where he was saying, yeah, I think I want to do a fund like this. George Floyd happened, and now all of a sudden Marcus is at the center of an enormous amount of capital, social capital, financial capital, and entrepreneurial interest in saying, we need to do something different in Minneapolis, and there's an extraordinary amount of activity going on there as an example. Another example in the cohort is the Black Farmer Fund in New York State, a group of African-American women who have said, we actually need to restore Black farmers to land. And we've got to find a way to have, again, Black folks making decisions about how to use their capital and their relationships and their knowledge to restore agriculture to Black hands. And it's important to say that using non-accredited investors, folks who are not wealthy, ordinary folks having an opportunity to invest in the enterprises they serve. And then just one more I'll highlight is Vanessa Roanhorse and the folks in New Mexico with Native Women Lead, who are already very well along their path of raising and deploying capital to Native women entrepreneurs. So each of the cohort members has a different thesis that's suitable to their place. And then collectively, we can accelerate what we're doing as a field. So that's the intent.
That it's awesome, just the amount of rigor that it takes. And that's the biggest takeaway from me being, coming from the financial world, is the balance and the sensitivity that it takes to have both the financial rigor and this deep kind of commitment to impact and equity that you guys are, not claiming to be the experts at, but are learning in the journey, but you're willing to take the risk. And we need more people that are willing to take the risk like you guys are doing. And so I'm honored to be a part of that group. And, just the learnings and the framework and the thought process has been transformational for us in our journey. And so we're just glad to have people like you all on here supporting in what we're doing. And so let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the ecosystem, kind of how we're coming back into this space, And for those who've never heard the term integrated capital, I'm sorry I didn't like explain it at the beginning, but essentially it is using I want to do the most simplest form. It is using flexible forms of capital. So blended strategy, sometimes called blended capital. So that might be a mixture of debt or debt-like products, or it might be a mixture of grant or grant-like products, or it could be a mixture of equity and equity-like products. So that can span all the way from just a straight up grant and you're giving someone free money to a for equity investment, for you to scale up to the next level in growth, and then everything in between. So integrated capital really does explore the spectrum. And I love the fact that it meets the entrepreneurs at their needs and doesn't force them into a structure that may not be beneficial to them or their business or the communities that they're serving. So I hope we're all on the same level of what we're talking about here when we talk about integrated capital. So let's zoom out. And so Catherine, with Phillips Foundation, you guys are 100% or as close to, I don't know if it's 100%, I like to say that, or as close to impact investing foundations. That means all of your dollars go to for profit, for good, risk, impact, like you guys are in the thick of it in terms of how you guys structure. How do you all think about risk versus impact? I know there might be some funders that are tuning in. There might be some foundation folks that are tuning in about the risk, right? And so prioritize risk versus impact.
Thank you. That's a great question. And just for some context, Phillips Foundation is a relatively small 60 million family foundation that is co-located in North Carolina, Dallas. And as Benjamin mentioned, we are really 100% impact invested. And the purpose of a foundation is really the purpose of our foundation is to be charitable. And that means we are trying to make the world a more just, equitable, and peaceful place and ensure that the environment and humans flourish. And so when you think about how can we go about that, since foundations are essentially investment companies from, then we're an investment company that is trying to do good with a dollar that is we have influence over. And so thinking about the risk and return profile, we have different profiles for different capital. So for example, as a private foundation, we're required to expend 5% of our assets every year for charitable purposes. And so there we can make field building, which we do around building the social ecosystem, building the impact investing ecosystem. We can also make loans to nonprofits that counts towards the 5%. We can guarantees, which we often do. We'll guarantees for different ways we make them direct, and then we also participate in a collaborative vehicle. As a small foundation, our impact comes from collaborating. We helped create the Community Investment Guarantee, which is an unfunded guarantee facility that capital for diverse entrepreneurs, and I can dive into some examples a bit later. But and then of course our investment portfolio, and then 5% of the assets, and we have different sleeves within that portfolio. So for example, there's a sleeve where we take impact into higher consideration than we do return, and then for another portion of that portfolio, because that is our only way of making money. So we do and Mr. Phillips wanted the foundation to exist in perpetuity. So we do have investments where we put impact on an equal plane with financial return. And so really, when I think about integrated capital, we are integrating our values into every single way that we use capital. But some of the most meaningful work we do is to help, really it's to help educate others around what the real risk is. And I think that's something that there's so much data that shows entrepreneurs of color are no more risky, and in fact, instances are less risky investing in white male entrepreneurs. And so a lot of the work that we do is in providing incentives and serving as the risk capital so that we can deconstruct that false narrative around misperceived risk. And so I'll stop there because I've covered a lot.
Credit a lot that I think foundations and maybe even foundations in Dallas, are not yet exploring or looking into in terms of the opportunities that are out there. And so I love the fact that you're bringing, you said educating, right? You're bringing the knowledge and the tools and the proven strategies to be able to help do something different, right? Like as we continue to solve these complex problems, we know that there's going to be complex solutions that come along with them. And so the work that you're doing is amazing to see, and how it inspires and trickles to others. Is my next question is a follow-up to that, right? Normally when we talk about ESG investing, typically racial equity is not in the equation, and more we're seeing the conversation be, more and more involved. Racial equity should be embedded in impact investing, because a lot of times when you say impact investing, they don't mean funding Black and brown entrepreneurs. The typical profile is, we're putting in, some sewage system or some, water in Africa or a developing country. That's typically the profile of impact investing, right? But to know that investing for racial equity is still impact. And so what are you all doing around how you embed racial equity into that deployment strategy?
Thanks for asking that, because we bring a racial equity and a gender equity to everything that we do, even when we're hiring our auditor. So it really is just part of the fabric of our being. But I'll give two examples that I think will highlight different aspects, strategies that we use. So is how do we, as I mentioned, we try to capital that is not flowing based on misperception. So I mentioned that we helped create this unfunded guarantee pool, the community investment guarantee pool, that right now is at $7 million. And I'll give an example of one of our recent investments. What we're essentially doing is our balance sheet and the reputation foundation to make lenders, commercial lenders, feel more comfortable about lending to entrepreneurs of color, really is through their CRA credits, so through community development financial institutions. And I'll give an example of a recent guarantee that we made. So it was LISC, which is a FI that's based, actually it's all over the country, but they really were interested in ensuring that entrepreneurs of color who are working in the affordable housing industry were able to get access to capital, because Benjamin's already provided the stats. They're not getting access to capital. They are more familiar with the communities that they're served, so they can actually do a better job of serving them. So we gave a promise of $3 million that they could use, turn around as a guarantee, turn around and use with banks to secure funding. They were able to secure so we give the 6 million guarantee. They were able to secure $36 million in funds from other sources. And those must be earmarked for entrepreneurs working in the affordable housing sector who are people of color. And so that's one way of, and the idea is that once those banks see, oh, there weren't any defaults, or there certainly weren't any more than there are with our other loans, then they will no longer be able to justify implicit and explicit bias in their funding decisions. So that's one way that we're using racial equity investments to shift systems. Another way, and that's obviously investment as a guarantee. Another through market rate investments. So we recently invested in a fund of funds called Illumin Cap, and this fund of funds invests in impact, and then it puts those impact funds through a 10-year racial and gender equity diversity training curriculum, and measures the fund's progress against benchmarks. And so that is a way of not only changing the finance industry, which is not very diverse. It's changing the industry, so helping the firms identify their explicit and implicit bias and unwind that. But then it also is allowing them to be more diverse, to invest in more diverse impact managers. And so that will help funnel capital to impact managers that are often overlooked because they don't look like the all-white male investment committee. So those are two racial equity examples that I think highlight the systemic change lens that we use in our work. That's
amazing work that you guys are doing, and just the catalytic side of it, of $6 million unlocking $36 million. Like, I think that's just a powerful impact that you can point to say this is what our dollars are able to do and multiply. And so all of you all are literally catalytic in all of your work. And so the thing is there's not a model out there. Like, everyone is figuring out and learning and growing in this space. And I think that's the amazing part of where we are as a community. Even though we're going through probably our probably worst social and economic, downturn and state in the history of this country, that we can think of having both a global pandemic, and an uprising of social unrest and police brutality all at the same time. We need risk takers like this that are doing innovative work that there's not a model for. It's not a blueprint, for. And so I want to zoom out into a quick ecosystem discussion or a question to all of you all. So feel free to answer. We'll probably take 2 answers if you can kind of keep them brief. And then I want to give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions to you all as well. Everyone's talking about, the George Floyd situation and how this has brought, a deeper awareness, to us all to reexamine our systems. What are the untapped opportunities that we're not exploring that could be leveraged more to help you all do the work, us all do the work that we do better? So feel free to hop in.
I'll jump in, Ben. So I'll talk a little bit about 1555, but I also feel like at times like this, particularly if you're kind of looking at whatever the problem's right in front of you, it can feel overwhelming. And I've had the really great fortune of, across my career, intersecting and interacting with systems in ways that change occurred. So it gives me hope and optimism. And I really, outside of the capital conversation, I think it's really important for this group of people on the phone and on video to recognize that big change can happen with pretty quickly. So in my 20s, I was involved with the reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act, which unlocked opportunities and funding for young people across the country with the stroke of a pen. Early in my career at Living Cities, I was the chief impact officer there with $100 million of investment across the country. The collaborative of funders there actually helped work through and with the IRS to make sure that the money that goes through program-related investments, a tool that we're talking about now, was counted towards the 5% for the IRS. That sounds really tactical and strange, but it's the reason why foundations now can talk about using their funds for impact investing. Some group somewhere, way before people were talking about it in the early 2000s, worked through the legal issues to unlock that. I worked in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where they were seeing that rail systems were actually consistently avoiding communities of color. And they worked with the federal government to change the formula on how rail systems are funded. And now anybody who starts a rail now can tap into that. So those are just 3 examples of things that I've seen to change systems in a large way. And so when I talk about what it takes to change capital systems in a large way, I think for Black businesses in particular, we need to focus on the existing businesses we have and really shoring up and growing their recovery and their resilience. There's a lot of focus on the new shiny objects, the new shiny toys, but most Black businesses are not growing at a rate as quickly, and there's very few funding opportunities for businesses that exist. We also need to reimagine what's possible and what we believe in for Black businesses. If you look at industry, high revenue industries are ones where you have higher jobs. So if you're kind of thinking about this trifecta of racial wealth gap, economy driving, and hiring folks, you want to focus on high revenue industries. take utilities, for instance. Utilities is a $3 trillion industry, and Black businesses have 80 some million dollars from it. Why? Because there are only 18 Black businesses in utilities. So if you kind of think about an acquisition strategy, for instance, where you are actually starting to put more Black business owners, not just through growth, but also through acquisition into positions of power and influence, you can see that change and growth in a different way as well. And that's doable. That can be done. 18, you can count on your hand. You can double that. Like, you can count that and think about that in your head.
I'm like,
another thing I think that's happening from an ecosystem standpoint that's really powerful is an opportunity I'm working on with several financial institutions across the country called Underwriting for Racial Justice. And all these onesie-twosie folks across the, like Ben and everyone, you know, we're working with you, Ben, and other folks try to make sure you can change the system where you are. What would it look like if financial institutions' underwriting practices were actually solved? Right? So this group called Underwriting for Racial Justice is financial institutions across the country, not one or two, but across the country, interrogating their due diligence practices, their collateral practices. Because the thing is, yes, we are all learning as we're going, but I was investing in character-based lending decades ago now, right? Yep. There's enough examples. Yeah. There's enough proof points. And so it's really time for us to really push on the system at its root source and its root cause, so you don't have to face it now. And that's kind of, you know, everyone has to fight the battle where they are. People in ecosystem work need to hold themselves accountable to facing it the farther and farther upstream, so we don't have to solve for it at the local level today.
Amen. Mic drop. Solve all the problems. No, Ty, you are right on. It comes down to policy, right? And the rules that are written in a way to construct and be extractive. And a lot of times we're a part of the system and don't know that we are. And so I think I take ownership in being a part of that. Coming from the traditional financial system is relearning and reimagining what that really means to unlock capital, really embed equity, not just from I see you, a person of color, you see me, person of color, but from a policy, a structural standpoint. Those things are really, you know, the laws that don't have color, that we don't see. Those are the things that I think we should focus on. I wish I could do the I wish, what if, because I know that would probably be a powerful thing with this group. But I'm going to give our audience a chance because they're probably salivating in there wanting to ask you guys questions. So we're gonna cut that part a little short and take some questions. We'll probably take about 3 questions, and then they're going to get started at about 1:15. So we'll take about 5 minutes here to answer some audience questions. I'm guessing my folks down here in the moderating panel, do you guys have questions? Because I think I can buzz you in. All right, well, while we wait, we're going to go ahead and throw in another question for you all from my list here. What are some of the, I guess I'll wait on that. This is to tie in, but well, actually to everyone in the group. What are some of the tangible action items that financial institutions, foundations, philanthropists, investors can take with today to start solving some of these challenges in their community? I know, Ty, you just touched on a little bit. Well, what are some other ones that are working and folks can take away from this conversation and really help be a part of this movement?
Well, I'd love to jump in and just speak from the perspective of the foundation. I think one of the most powerful things that any of us can do, or how much wealth we have, is think about how can we be the friends and family to people who have been excluded and kept for 400 years plus. And that's a real responsibility, and it is a way people can make a difference in their own community, whether that's patronizing businesses run by people, whether that's providing a Kickstarter loan, or whether whether it's from the foundation perspective, stepping in with seed capital for initiatives such as created capital investment funds. So I think there's really, no matter how much we each have, there are things we can do. I know Deborah allows investments, I think at a minimum of $100 or something. So that's something I think everyone can do regardless of their assets.
Thank you, Catherine. Deborah, I know you got 11 groups over there that could use some support. What are some of the ways you feel like people can help what you're working on or be a part of the process?
Yeah, so I first of all, people can invest, like Catherine said, and I think there's a lot more investment opportunity, whether that's local or national. But I think that there's some mindset shifts that need to occur. And two of them, one I mentioned before, is this idea of disaggregating capital and power. The system that we've got has accumulated capital in the hands of the few, and those few, even the well-intentioned ones who want to support racial justice, are still have maintained their accumulation of power in the decision-making about it. And so that's the piece that I think we really need to address, which is whether it is in foundations or among investors, why do we have the same people who accumulated wealth being the ones making the decisions about the redistribution of it? And that, so that idea of whether it's something that, we're exploring in the cohort, which is participatory grant making, where the grant making, the money has accumulated, those are not the decision makers. It's actually the recipients or peers or others who decide how capital should be granted and even invested. So I think that's one piece, is we've really got to disaggregate this. The second is this sort of addressing this paradox, which is, if you're interested in addressing inequality through your investing activity and you are pursuing market rate returns, you are by definition amplifying inequality. There's no way around it. The market rate will grow your wealth faster than the people who don't have wealth. And so when people start talking, and Catherine, I'm a big fan of a full range of approaches like you all are taking. I think it's extraordinary what you're doing at your foundation. But people talk about concessionary. When they say concessionary, here's the market rate, and then I'm going to take this concession to the market rate. I think we need to address the question of whether it's a concession if inequality is something that you care about. And so this notion of moving money in a way that redistributes wealth to where it's been extracted from, while still getting a living return, a 3% return. We can, we use biomimicry. That's a whole other conversation about what's an appropriate return. But I think we have to address the assumption that people have an impact investing, which is you can do well by doing good, and everything is a win-win. When you're talking about inequality, we've got to rethink that so that money is moving from where it's accumulated to where it's been extracted from.
Here. And if I could just mention a quick resource for people that want to activate their money for good, there's a resource called moneytransforms.com, and a group of our fellows put it together. And so if people want to learn, how to bank locally, how to do more to invest for social and environmental impact, how to move their retirement funds, vote with their dollars, etc., go to moneytransforms.com.
Awesome resource. Let's take one of the questions, and thank you guys for providing some of those solutions that we can take away from Vincent in the audience. Would love to hear more on underwriting and due diligence for racial equity. Could you dig into more unique factors when taken into account? Deborah, I love the example that you always give about the entrepreneur. I forget what the company, but you guys funded like 6 different types of capital in that structure over the life of their business. I love that. The perfect example. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's and Deb spoke about this with the capital, there's a layering of capital that's needed when you're looking at the sort of chronic gaps in the capital market. And so where you might come in with a grant for a feasibility study that's followed by some working capital line of credit that's very risky, which as they grow, you might have a term loan, or you might have a piece of convertible debt, or you might do a royalty structure, and you might do what's called their equity back. So there's a number of things in deploying integrated capital with a range of return expectations and a greater risk tolerance. And I just want to name on risk, we have to ask the question of thinking about risk from the perspective of the risk of not making these investments, the risk of leaving people behind again and again and again, and take that into our definition of risk. So we look at that when we think about due diligence and underwriting. We also look at the question of, what if we are the lender of last resort? What if this person has nowhere else to go? It is our responsibility to find a way to get this investment to work. And that might mean where we go to a partner like Catherine at Phillips and say, will you put a guarantee behind this so we can move money? Or someone who will say, will you put friends and family risk capital to work? Will you raise direct public offering money so ordinary folks in the community can chip in capital and wrap their arms around this entrepreneur and help them move forward? So instead of saying underwriting and due diligence is in order to protect our investment, the underwriting and due diligence is how do we wrap social capital, financial capital, and knowledge capital around this entrepreneur so they'll be successful over the long term.
Ben, there's another effort called Due Diligence 2.0 that's specifically focused on venture capital. And that effort is addressing some of the reasons why there's only 1% or less than 1% of VC funds that go to Black firms. So one of the things that they have a few of the things that they have suggested on that is one, white owners tend to get paid based on potential, and BIPOC and women get paid based on proof. And so thoughtful about what measure are you holding a BIPOC or woman company to. The other one is be first. In VC world, it's all about who's your anchor funder, who's the first funder. So pushing everyone to just thinking about what would it take for us to be the first funder, the first anchor. And that's psychological just as much as it is on anything else. The other thing is BIPOC and women companies tend to have longer due diligences. So on top of everything, you're whittling down not how much they get, when they get it, and it takes them longer. So like respect their time. So these are the types of things in VC where it's not necessarily like kind of the due diligence criteria that you can look at a score or some of those other stuff. It's basically psychological on what you believe about what's possible for this company and their growth.
And when you say it takes longer, and that runway is much, much shorter for entrepreneurs of color, right? To where they don't have the luxury of doing a 6-month fundraising process. You're talking about raising venture capital. The minimum you're going to take is about 6 to 9 months to raise any type of capital in that space. If you're, person of color, if you're a Harvard graduate and, Yale, and you can walk into a room of your dad's golf buddies and, do a quick pitch, it might take you a weekend, right? But we don't have the luxury of the runway, and so many suffer in numerous ways and stories that I've personally seen, that I've personally experienced. And you're exactly right. We have to take these new strategies. Let's go to a few more questions, and then we will wrap it up. They are starting pitches in the main. So if you want to go watch some of the pitches that have just started, they're doing a Q&A right now. You're welcome to do that. But we're going to take a 2 questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. This has been such a insightful conversation that I wish can we do this once a week? Like all of us, I know some of us do this once a month. Actually, all of us. Deb, we're going to put you on the schedule once a month to join. But Mari Miller says, people assume entrepreneurship requires that you have your own idea and start from the ground up. Ty mentioned acquisition models for the panel. Please expound on you and your organization's approach on funding to support acquisition-based entrepreneurs.
I'm happy to jump in on that. So you may have heard of the phrase, the silver tsunami, which is the retiring baby boomers who have nowhere to put their businesses. So we pursue that strategy. So we just did one. There's a coffee repair company, not a big business, but a solid, viable, long-term local business, and a white husband-wife couple retiring. And just when they were starting to retire, the husband died and she was running it. And so we're like, let's transition this to BIPOC ownership. So It was first time entrepreneurs in terms of the couple that we brought in, or we didn't bring in, that we partnered with to acquire this company. Longtime coffee repair guy, and he understood the business, and his wife was an entrepreneur. And so a lot of work together to do an acquisition. It's very different type of approach, and there are culture issues, and there's inheriting something that makes sense and stuff that doesn't make sense, especially if it's a family business. So all the complexity, just, as much complexity as a startup. But that's a real opportunity. And we've done a couple of those where it's either an acquisition or an existing company that's transitioning to worker ownership, which is another significant way to approach this succession issue. And so we think that's a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs of color.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. The approach that we've been working on sharing with more folks is partnering with corporations, walking with them through what their major procurement lines are, and then deciding which businesses to acquire that would allow them to meet their minority business and women business entrepreneur goals by picking acquisition. So that is both with funders, but also oftentimes people don't recognize that companies often are doing JVs behind the scenes themselves, or mergers and acquisitions behind the scenes themselves. And so you can leverage corporate capital for that, as well as funder capital.
That is so we're having those conversations as well. And there's a lot of missed opportunities across different industries when you talk about procurement that aren't being explored by Black and brown founders. And so what we're doing is doing the backwards approach and saying, where are the opportunities? Where are the dollars? And then going and finding good entrepreneurs and saying, hey, these are opportunities in the market, who's going to take these opportunities, because they're there and corporations want to spend and they have to spend and they monitor the spend. So definitely what you guys are saying. Let's go to Jeff and then we'll wrap up with this last question. We're probably way over. To Deborah's fantastic framing, what are some of the other great resources for founders and funders to the tune of precision of their own vocabularies around both asking for and deploying impact capital of many kinds?
I've pointed toward Deb Nelson on that, because so we have a bunch of resources, but Deb, you guys have a ton of resources at RSF, and including the link that you put up already.
Yeah, I would say check out moneytransforms.com. And if you really want to learn more about how you leverage different forms of financial and social capital, if you're a financial activist and you want to be part of a community of practice, check out our Integrated Capital Institute. It's not just what RSF is doing, it's what all kinds of movers and shakers and thought leaders are doing. And everyone learns from each other. And so if people have questions that they want to learn more about anything that we're doing.
I'll say a very good resource, and Jeff, you're familiar with this as a mentor in our program, is we've leveraged Village Capital's resources that they've been able to provide, the viral tool, the Venture Investment Readiness Assessment Learning Tool. We've been able to kind of dissect that and break it down for both equity-focused types companies as well as debt and traditional small business type focuses. And it really has democratized the language in articulating value when you're talking about asking investors for capital. And so that's a really accessible resource for founders out there to go to Village Capital and download their viral tool. It really allows you to understand your business in a very simple kind of grading rubric type scale of format, and it really allows them to have more equitable conversations with investors. So I will offer that resources. So I'm going to go ahead and close our discussion today. This has been such a powerful, insightful discussion with you all. I respect you all tremendously in your unique spaces that you all are thriving in, and look forward to continue collaboration with you all. If there's any quick last words you guys want to leave, I know we've kind of taken a lot of time here, but if you do, go ahead and jump in. If not, we'll go ahead and close out, and we'll all head back to the showcase where we have the club who is pitching right now. So.
Thank you, Ben. Hats off to you. Keep going.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank the team. They're all amazing individuals and help this work push forward. Our board, everybody, you guys as partners. And so amazing. Yes, as VR said, amazing session. Excited to continue this work with you all. And so I will see you all in on the main stage with our pitches. So see you all later. Thanks for joining.
Benjamin.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.